All right, let's get straight to the talking point where I have Mr. Olumide Lala, who is the head market program for Africa at the Climate Bond Initiative. Thank you for your time on this program. First, let me quickly go straight to the first question. There are lots of challenges in the African continent, and if you have to take it down to each of the country, especially Nigeria, you have a lot of issues, but the most pressing issues for you, perhaps let's start from there. What is it that is so pressing that you think we need to tackle in terms of infrastructure, a whole lot? Let's start from there.
Thank you very much for having me on your program. I think you've indicated correctly. Africa and Nigeria especially, we have a number of challenges to face that we face today. Starting from job security to food security, national issues, all the way through to political challenges and the likes. But when you put all of that together and you begin to think what actually is the basis of all of this stuff, interesting enough, I like to say top of the agenda for me is climate change. And you might wonder how and why. We're actually sitting here in the picturesque view and environment of the Freedom Park, with trees and water and all of that around us, and it's a cool environment. But we run a country today where we're having suffering a lot of deforestation from because of the way we even as much as cook our own food, the energy we generate. We talk about increased droughts, increased floods, sea level rising, and these are the things which are impacting us. Take Lagos, for instance, the chance of urbanization. Lagos is increasing in size today because of the free movement of people from the hinterlands. And that's because they're having to move away from environments where are no longer sustainable because of lack of opportunities. The issue, though, however, is that Lagos over the last 30 to 40 years have not developed the infrastructure to meet this number of people. And so you have a number of people walking around Lagos today without jobs. We spend hours in traffic. We generate our energy using diesel rather than more clean energy. Electricity is a challenge. Business environment is difficult. But this is the scary bit. If you think Lagos is difficult today with the number of people we have here, which is about sub 20 million, it's predicted by in the next 20, 30 years, it's going to grow to another 30 to 35 million. If we have problems solving the issues today, we're going to have a major problem unless we start to look at things that allows us to meet the needs and challenges of a growing population. And the way we see it is that if you solve Lagos, you solve Nigeria, and if you solve Nigeria, pretty much you will solve Africa, because 1 in every 4 African is Nigerian. So the challenges, yes, are infrastructure, but I don't like to look more of the challenges. I like actually to look at the opportunities, not necessarily the solutions, but the opportunities that we can deploy to solve a lot of these problems.
Okay, let me come in here. You talked about how this is affecting us, of course, the issue of drought, the issue of a whole lot, climate issues.
Yes.
But how significant would you say is this effect on the people, on the country? Let's start from Nigeria,
okay,
because you made mention of Lagos as well.
Let me give you an interesting example. If you look at the issue we have today, which is one of national security, and specifically in the Northeast, we talk about Boko Haram today. And I often say to people, Boko Haram actually started as a climate change issue, because Lake Chad, which was a source of economy and livelihood for many people, has shrunk by 80%. Lake Chad, in the old days, you used to actually see Lake Chad in Nigeria. Today, you need to go into Cameroon to actually see Lake Chad. So if you think about all of those people who are dependent on their food, their water, their agriculture, their animal husbandry, all of these people today have no form of livelihood. Now, the next thing is we need more, typically from our culture, what you then have is more children to go and probably sell stuff for you rather than be in schools. When it gets even harder, we end up with child brides. People marry their children off a lot earlier because they can't just feed them. That's a fundamental issue. We got young boys who are being inducted into terrorist groups because they feel a sense of belonging that they don't get in the villages.
I know there are quite a lot of opportunities. We'll get to that, but there are those who say, for instance, that the government all the time resort to borrowing to fund projects. Of course, even though those projects are laudable and, of course, are supposed to be productive at the end of the day, there are those who say this in the long run may not be sustainable. So what would you say is that approach? Okay, or what approach would you rather suggest that the government adopt?
Look, I'll agree with you. It's certainly not sustainable. You could argue that the government does borrow too much, but the government also has a responsibility to provide infrastructure, security to its citizens. I guess in an environment whereby we pay a lot of taxes, you could argue that that is required. But the reality is that we don't pay enough taxes as a group in Nigeria, so the money available to the government to even meet its basic needs is very limited. Globally, governments will always borrow. It's not the fact that you borrow that matters, it's what you actually spend it on. So infrastructure for capital, borrowing for capital expenditure is not a problem. The issue with Nigeria is we borrow too much for operational expenses rather than capital expense. That said, however, the government can only borrow so much. I mean, we've got this concept that a government will never go out of business, and that's the reason why whatever they raise, we can invest in. I guess if you ask the Greeks, they will tell you different. The point is, we cannot burden the government too much because it's literally kicking the problem down the long grass. That's why the private sector must act and work with the government to take some of that burden off. It is to these opportunities that we see why the Green Bond Market Development Program was set up. It was set up by three groups of people. The Climate Bonds Initiative, who are the foremost knowledge on green bonds. FSD Africa, which is financial sector deeply in Africa, which is an entity set up by DFID in the UK to help build and deepen capital markets in Africa, and FMDQ, which is a local exchange in Nigeria as a partner to the program. And essentially what it's doing is to build capacity within the market and develop the green bond ethos so that people begin to understand the opportunities that are available to them. What we've spent the last 18 months doing is working with SEC, for instance, to work on their issuance rules. We've worked with both the FMDQ and the NSC to talk about their listing rules. We've worked with the capital markets generally, the participants on the sell side, supply side and the demand side, to build capacity, public sector, the environment, CBN, DMO, to name it but a few. The idea is to build capacity within the system for people to understand four things. The fundamentals of green bonds are this. The assets that you select to finance have to be sustainable. They have to be revenue generating. Okay. They're typically infrastructure based. The way the money is allocated, be it the allocated funds or unallocated funds, how do you manage that money, the transparency that comes with that. More importantly, the reporting also on the impact that those projects have. So we talk about afforestation, for instance. It might interest you to know that 50% of the cooking energy used in Nigeria is from firewood. 40% is from kerosene, and 5% coal, and 5% LPG, gas. Now, if you think about the fact that we have a deforestation issue in Nigeria, even if you reduce the amount of firewood used for cooking and begin to put an afforestation program into Nigeria,
that's right.
Just having the trees around us in itself has a way of correcting nature in the way that it disperses all the gases and takes them in. So there's a need to have more trees, for instance, and a few more forests amongst us. There's a need to have energy to provide jobs and create new jobs for industry. There's a need to have a proper infrastructure. And we're not talking infrastructure about building roads, by the way. I don't care how many roads you build in Lagos. In fact, you probably couldn't build any more roads anyway. We need to start moving people more en masse. So the likes of the Oga at the top, who is sitting in the back of the SUV on his own, we need to change that concept and people begin to believe in actually going by train. Just imagine for a second, if you were able to build a metro line between Lekki Phase 1 toll gates all the way to Ekpe, the number of cars you would take off the road will reduce your journey time and improve your productive time. At work. We will get to work less stressed than we are today, and we'll become more productive. That's just an example. if we actually start using solar, more solar generated power, the pollution that is impacting our nation will disappear over a period of time. The generators will go away, the noise pollution will go away. So we can actually improve our lives. Now, these are moving you into new industries, which are generating new jobs. Because as the population grows, you need more jobs. So actually going green makes financial sense.
So the word green bond, it's what you can say is for raising or borrowing
Yes.
to fund climate change
Related and
issues.
and sustainability, ESG type projects, yes.
Oh, okay, let's quickly look at the nature of these bonds we're talking about. So is it locally done, or how does it work? You're looking at outside the shores of Nigeria now.
Okay, so just to give you some examples. Right now we have $460 billion worth of green bonds globally outstanding.
$150 billion US dollars. 460 billion US dollars.
US dollars outstanding globally. The trajectory is towards the $1 trillion. But here's the interesting thing. If you look to Africa, we have less than $1.5 billion. So in the final analysis, you will argue that climate change is real and it's impacting the people and their livelihood, basically.
A lot of people will be thinking, perhaps watching this program, and so, how do you tie the climate change or the operation of the Boko Harams in the northeast to climate change, and how does it even relate? A lot of people will be wondering, because some of them will think that the Boko Haram ideology is against the Western education, and so they won't even talk about issue of perhaps lags or lack of employment or on their own part, that they have their ideology. And so how do we marry all of this together?
Okay. So I guess I'll start by asking you a question. When was the last time you see somebody who was filled up in the stomach, the son of a rich man, go and do terrorism? The long story short is you begin to play people's minds when they've got no jobs, they've got no food, and they're looking for a sense of belonging. So when you've got things to do and you're gainfully employed, you don't actually get involved in these things. The long story short is simple, in my opinion. If you look around the world today, we have increased droughts, we have increased flooding, we have increased fires. There's a city out in California today that just got burnt out. It's called Paradise. The entire city got wiped out. Now, they've been living within the forest for a very long time, but the global temperature is actually rising. And even today in Lagos, we sit very close to a coast, yet we feel the heat. It's not necessarily because it is not always the case, but the frequency of these things and these occurrences is increasing. We're having more floods and more fires and more droughts. The Sahara Desert is actually increasing in size. What it's doing is moving people and bringing them in conflict with other people that typically they would not have been in conflict with. So you begin to have issues with your herdsmen going into the farmlands and the likes, and people begin to have a bit more disagreements amongst each other. If all of this were not happening, people quite happily stay where they are and have their livelihood. Now, you spoke about the fact that it's Western ideology and all that stuff. Well, you can manipulate somebody when he has a need. When that need is no longer there, they won't listen to you. It's that simple.
Oh, okay, how do you think we can solve all of this problem? Because we need to develop our market, we need to, infrastructure is there, the power issue is there, integration is also there within the African continent, and of course even within each country resident in the African continent. So I'm wondering, where do you think we need to start from? The urgency of these problem. How do you think we can begin to tackle it, or where do you think we can start from?
So this is obviously a capital markets interview. Now, interestingly enough, the capital markets are set up to generate capital for large-scale development. The problem we have in Africa typically is that we leave all our developmental infrastructure development needs to the government, who then borrows money against our future. What we're looking to do here is get the corporates and the subnationals to actually take on that burden to generate those bonds and those lendings to those infrastructure development, so that you and I can invest in this through our pension funds. And then you take the burden away from the government, and it's actually the private sector that begins to generate and initiate all of this money through the capital markets, which is what it was set up for in the first place. So just to bring to you what is a green bond, because I think we had this conversation earlier. A green bond is just like any other bond in the structure. The only difference is the use of proceeds. What do you use that for? So an example, for instance, rather than set up a power station using diesel and fossil fuel that is contaminating and polluting the world, you use the natural, such as your solar, your wind, and these are sustainable type sources of energy.
That's right.
Geothermal and the likes. Because obviously we need to move away from extraction to actually process type energy sustainability. Now, when you start to build energy capacity, then you begin to be able to create jobs, which are quite needed. An example I'll give you real quick. If you look at Nigeria, for instance, we have a population of 180 million or so, it is stated. You need 1,000 megawatts per million people to industrialize. Japan, for instance, has 126 million people. They generate and distribute 312,000 megawatts. South Africa has 55 million people. They generate and distribute 50,000 megawatts. Nigeria has 180 million people. We can hardly distribute 5,000 megawatts, in spite of what it is you generate. So you've got to move away from the distribution side into the generation, and that's where your mini grids come into play. If there's one thing I will focus on in terms of trying to catalyze and energize the development of Nigeria through the industrialization process, will be to provide energy through renewables. Solar, wind, water, hydro, geothermal. Turning waste into energy, turning your solar, which is freely given, into energy. We need the capital market to provide the catalyzing funding to be able to do this. That's why the capital markets are there. And that's why the issues of green bonds make sense in Nigeria especially.
Olumide, let's quickly take a moment. We will come back and talk more.
Now, if you think, like as I was trying to explain, Africa generally is being impacted the most by climate change. We didn't start the problem, the industrial nations did. But we are being impacted the most. We have the fastest growing number of droughts, the fastest growing number of floods, the fastest shrinking and all of the stuff. Yet we have the fastest growing population in Africa. So if you think about it, we need, if I've just told you that the population of Nigeria is 180 million and 65% of Nigerians are under 30, what does that tell you? Basically, in the next 30 years, the population of this country will grow to 450, 500 million very easily in the next 30 years. How are you going to feed them? We import food today. And if you ask people, it's because it costs more to generate the food here because of lack of power. What jobs are you going to give them? So we need to start thinking differently. We need to start looking at the environment.
So these are issues.
These are issues for which there are opportunities for us to take over. Now, you ask, where are these bonds being generated?
Exactly. Because if you say 1 over a billion,
yes,
right? $1 billion US resident in Africa,
yes,
it means that the rest will be outside the shores.
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. But what we're saying here is that we need, I remember I said earlier, it is not how much you borrow, it's what you do with it. Yeah? We have 8 trillion naira in our pension funds today, heavily geared towards government securities. If we start generating corporate bonds, yeah, that fund through the banks, through the institutions, Dangote, your Shell, your Sterling, your Axis Bank, your UBA, all of these entities, the states, start generating debts that fund all of this infrastructure development. Now, don't forget, these are infrastructure development that are revenue generating. I'm not saying fund stuff that is just going to be big elephants. You fund stuff that are revenue generating, which means your revenue will come to pay down the debt over time.
So that means the proceeds now?
Yes, the proceeds.
Okay.
The revenue generated from the investment you make. So
from the borrowing.
So you raise the money, you invest in capital assets,
and then you generate.
That generates revenue. So if, for instance, somebody creates a bond that funds an energy asset, those energy assets are sold to you and I. We now pay for the power. The power, the money that we pay goes back to pay down that debt. But don't forget, after the debt has been paid, the infrastructure is still there, generating revenue for the future. These are new industries that will create new jobs. So we are actually getting the money back. over time. Now, the point is, you then partner, those institutions are partnering with the government to take the burden of the government. And that's where the corporate bonds come into play. Are you with me? But it's the greenness, what you invest in it, that makes it green. Are you with me?
Yes, of
So
course.
the interesting thing here is that you begin to solve some of the problems that we have today in terms of power generation and energy availability for developing the economy. So over time, you begin to reduce the importation that you make because you're able to produce locally cheaper.
That's
So
right.
as you produce local cheaper, you're creating more jobs, there's more money left in the market, because previously, every time you import, you're selling FX. So you begin to even improve your own economy. So it makes financial sense over time to go down this route.
Interesting. Let's also look at the fact that the government should start today, for instance, raise about $5 billion US dollars, talking about green bonds.
Yes.
Which of the sector do you think that the government should start concentrating at the moment? Because I know you made mention of power. You made mention of other sectors that we need to look at. Infrastructure. If you put all of that together, I mean issues fundamentally.
Yes.
And so, what sector really do you think we can hit?
Before I answer that question,
Yeah.
I will state here clearly, I am not an advocate for government borrowing money. I am not. Because the more money government borrows, the more indebted the country becomes.
Okay.
So what I'm saying here is that the corporates should actually be the ones issuing the bonds.
Issuing the bonds.
Now, think about it this way. Your pension fund, I said, has 8 trillion naira there. If the corporates begin to borrow money and they actually implement proper corporate governance
Yeah.
to these organizations and create the confidence for the PFAs to actually begin to invest in these companies, your pension fund will begin to invest in the infrastructure of this country rather than waiting for the government to borrow the money. So the corporates that begin to borrow the money, for which the investment comes from the private sector. And that takes the government out of the equation. In fact, the Green Bonds program, as I indicated earlier, the main objective of that is to build this non-sovereign side of the market, the subnational, especially the corporate side of the market, which at the moment is marginal. That's the whole idea of the program. So if we focus on the actually non-governmental side of the equation, that is where the opportunity lies. Because the money that is coming from private sector can invest in the corporate sector and generate and finance these assets which are more sustainable, enabling us to create more jobs, build better industries, take away all these polluting generators, and create a future. Food security becomes a less of an issue. National security, obviously, it becomes less of an issue. But we need to move this mentality that it's the government that needs to borrow to fund infrastructure. It needs to move to the corporate sector.
Okay, so the government has to create. How about the environment? Of course, is another issue where those corporate sector can thrive after investing some of these bonds into them.
It's a good thing you just said that. The government obviously has an issue. The government has an issue, has a part to play. I often ask why the government raises money, free money, at double-digit interest rates. It makes no sense to me because it's just free money. I mean, the point is you're just indebting us and creating an environment whereby your resources are going towards paying for your debt.
Okay, I think the question I was going to ask you, LA, is this perhaps is a new terrain for Nigeria. So what would you consider the most challenging in developing this new investment instrument as it relates to domestic market here in Nigeria?
Like anything else, it's about knowledge and information. As you said, it's new to the market, so the market obviously doesn't understand it. That's clearly natural to be expected. And that's why the program itself, the Nigerian Green Bonds Market Development Program, is there to develop capacity. Develop capacity in the private sector, both on the demand side and the supply side. Develop capacity in the government side. Develop capacity even in the regulator side. So that's what we've been doing for the last 18 months. We've run a series. The program itself was launched on the 7th of June 2018. at the Radisson Blu. We had a number of participants, including the Honorable Minister of Environment there. We had our chief host, who was the Lagos State Governor, represented by his deputy. So the program kick-started at that point. And the idea is to run a number of training programs, workshops, capacity building exercises for the entire market. And we've probably done about 10 or so far in Abuja, in Lagos, on various occasions. Also there to provide hand-holding exercises for those trying to issue these bonds. So we're there to provide the support and the technical assistance because we understand that it's a new market and it has to be developed. So in terms of the next 3 years, that is what we'll be doing. Interesting enough, you might be aware that the federal government issued its first green bond in December last year. In fact, it was the first certified green bonds against the green bond standards globally. We're currently working with a number of issuers to issue a couple of new green bonds. Hopefully before the end of this year, some announcements might come through. You will also hear in the news talk about a second tranche perhaps from the federal government. But the ultimate goal of this is to build a vibrant corporate market that is actually issuing green bonds for infrastructure development.
I would like to, just to a quick one, your parting short, perhaps you want to relate any thoughts concerning the opportunities in this new terrain that we need to take advantage of, either by institutional investor or perhaps an individual investor who want to play in this new terrain?
I will say this, the future is bright. A number of things are coming to market over the next 3 to 5 years that when we look back will be innovative at the point, but to become norm then because of the lot of work that is going into it. You begin to see a lot of infrastructural development exercises going on. You begin to see individuals and even companies moving into moving their source of energy from generators to solar energy. I could mention a bank or two right now who are taking some of their branches off the grid. I know a bank whose branch in Surulere is totally on renewables. I know a bank right now that I've just come from who is taking its head office off the grid. It's going to be fully renewable using solar panels to generate energy for it. So the energy sector is probably the most pressing for Nigeria. However, if you move out of Lagos, you're probably looking at transportation, how we move goods, waste management. The opportunities are immense. They're just plentiful. And it is for every single Nigerian to believe in the future and begin to invest in that sustainable future that we're all looking and hoping for. What I call going back to the future. As a child, I used to go by train to boarding school. As a child, we never had a generator because we had enough light. As a child, I used to turn on the tap and water came from the mains. This will happen again in the future.
Well, let's leave it there. Olumide Lala, Head Africa Market Program at Green Bond Initiative. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's leave it there. We'll take a moment now. We'll be back. The show continues. Join us again.